The 2007 changes to the CDM regulations have been with us for a few months now. But what exactly do these changes mean for designers? The new approved code of practice and guidance accompanying the regulations is much more detailed than was previously the case. Now, it's hoped that this will make the updated CDM regulations and their application clearer, with much less room for debate. Well, last time we took an overview on the effect of the changes on each of the principal parties involved in the construction process. Today, we focus on the key role of designers in implementing CDM 2007.
And joining us in the studio are Andrew East from the Health and Safety Executive and Peter Caplehorn from Scott Brownrigg. Welcome to you both. Andrew, perhaps let me start with you. We'd first better outline really the changes to the regs. And I suppose the first big one is that almost all construction projects will be subject to CDM.
That's correct. CDM applies to all construction work. Unless you're a domestic client, if you're doing domestic work to your own house, your own property, then the client duties don't apply, but they apply to all other construction activities. And if the job lasts for over 30 days, then there's a requirement to notify the Health and Safety Executive.
And Peter, the other big change really is that the role of the planning supervisor disappears.
Indeed, yeah, the planning supervisor disappears, and we now have the creation of the role of the CDMC or CDM coordinator, and that really is quite a significant change, because it will focus much more attention on that key role in terms of coordination, cooperation, and I think it's a great move for the regulations.
And of course, the other big change, Andrew, the paperwork.
That's correct. One of the key reasons for the change is to try to get the industry to focus on managing risk in the construction process and move away from producing lots of paper and lots of procedures which don't necessarily help. The actual regulations themselves require 3 documents. The F10 notification I mentioned, a construction phase plan to detail how the work's to be done on site, and a file at the end to record relevant and useful information. All other paperwork should be of use and of value.
And Peter, I suppose the other main change is really with clients. They've really got to take hold of their responsibilities early in the project.
From the outset now, from initial design, clients are fundamentally involved. They have to engage a CDM coordinator. They have to notify the project if it's relevant. Basically, they have to buy into the fact that health and safety is part of the project. It's not something that's an adjunct that can be thrown away. And just harping back to the paperwork as well, you have a situation where previously people thought that lots of paperwork means that I'm doing a good job. And of course it doesn't. What's a good job is getting the health and safety right out on site where it counts.
Right, indeed, and more from both of you in a moment. Before we talk in detail about how this affects the designer, let's just briefly summarise these changes.
Well, first of all, the new regulations apply to all construction work. There are no exemptions. There are additional duties for construction sites lasting longer than 30 days, or 500 person days of construction work. The role of the planning supervisor has been removed, and there's the new role of CDM coordinator, which carries greater clarity in relation to competence assessment. The paperwork has also been simplified, the principal documents being the Health and Safety Construction Phase Plan and File. And finally, CDM aims to make clients accountable for the impact that they have on health and safety standards. In particular, the client must provide enough time and resources to allow the project to be delivered safely.
So let's talk about the designer then. Andrew, first of all, who is designated a designer under CDM 2007?
Right, well, the term designer under CDM is quite a broad term. It's not just the traditional architect or structural engineer. They, of course, are designers, but it does include all those that influence how things are done, specifying materials, but also heating and ventilation design and fit-out design, lighting. It's a broad term used in the regulations.
So that means, Peter, I mean, really, anybody who in any way influences the design is in these terms a designer?
Absolutely, Michael. Yeah, you have a situation where projects are quite complex these days. Lots of people do actually influence, either directly or indirectly, the design. And we can have a situation where, for instance, if a quantity surveyor insists on a change, cost saving, okay, legitimately, that's fairly straightforward, but it does mean that they would be attracting designers' duties if they push that forward on their own bat. And so therefore you can ask, well, are you competent to be a designer? And of course competency is spelt out in the new regulations as well.
So with the definitions clear, let's look at how CDM 2007 affects designers.
Well, as we've just been hearing, designers are not just the consultant team, but anyone who influences design. The regulations have been revised to give more clarity, but designers should still consider hazard elimination as a continuous part, and in fact right at the heart, of their duties. In particular, designers are expected to ensure that clients are aware of their duties, to ensure that they're competent to do the work, to coordinate their work with others so as to manage risk, to cooperate with the CDM coordinator, to provide information for the file, and then finally to design to avoid foreseeable risk, so far as is reasonably practical.
So lots of expectations there. I mean, Peter, let's start with hazard elimination. How far should designers go?
Well, that's a kind of open-ended question, insofar as the first thing that designers have to do is bring that into the mainstream of the design process. And so it shouldn't be something that is thought of at the end or as an additional facility. It should be something that you do as an everyday process during the process of design. Our view is that effectively a seasoned designer will take on board all kinds of issues, sustainability, energy, aesthetics and health and safety. And you will look at that process, and if there's something extraordinary, exceptional, then you identify that as a hazard to be discussed later with the rest of the team. In due course, when you get to site, or just prior to the start on site, you can identify those remaining hazards clearly in some simple paperwork. We favour a principle of having a register and extracts from drawings that identify precisely what you're talking about as the specific hazard. Simple, clear paperwork that can be used on site with the construction team is the way forward as far as we're concerned. We believe that's what the HSE feel is the right way to go as well.
Definitely, definitely.
Well, Andrew, interesting, because I'm wondering how, in the light of all this, what about the relationship between the client and the designer? How's that changed?
I think the relationship between the client and designer is quite an interesting one, because as the regulations are written, the first contact very often is with the designer. The client will engage the designer, and there's a clear duty on the regulations for the designer to explain the duties of the client to the client. The second one, I think, is much more explicit now, that the designer should consider the workplace regulations, which look at how buildings are designed, how they're going to be used, and how they're going to be maintained. Yeah. There's not just doing design and walking away. This should have great benefit to clients, because they're the ones that inherit the building, they have to maintain the building, so future risks and issues are managed at the design stage.
Peter, you look like you're itching to come in there.
I do, because I mean, we do regard it as a fundamental principle to make sure that clients are informed. And even clients that you work with on repeat business, it's still a duty of the designer to make sure that they understand their roles and responsibilities. But there's also a great deal of trust that needs to be built up between the designer and the client. And so therefore you have to ensure that you're informing them properly right from the outset. So even a simple letter on the point of engagement at the start of the project, which just says, Mr. Client, do you realise that you have a duty under CDM, and spell out the basic duties. We regard that as being a fundamental principle of good practice.
So people know where they stand.
Exactly.
All right. Let's move on to the issue of competency. Now, by what criteria is a designer meant to assess their own competency? Sure.
I mean, that's been made much clearer by the new approved code of practice, which is splendid, because this used to be a very, very difficult chestnut to crack. Fundamentally, if you are a member of a professional institution such as the IStruct or the ICE or the RIBA, then that, in the words of the approved code of practice, that is a very good sign that you are already competent, as long as you take part in their CPD structured programme of professional learning. So a good professional who's done his homework, who's passed all his exams and has quite a few years' experience under his belt of the particular work in hand, is deemed to be pretty competent.
Right.
And it's a question of therefore then spelling that out to the CDM coordinator and to the client, just in some simple paperwork again, to make sure that everybody is clear on exactly what is your experience.
And how do you see it, Andrew? Same way? I mean, this issue of assessing your own competency.
Yes, I think it's much clearer in the approved code of practice now about what that means. We've tried to take the vagueness out of that. And it is about people acting professionally. CDM is about procuring the construction process professionally, people acting professionally, giving professional advice so that the risks are reduced in the construction process.
Absolutely.
Lots of relationship issues here. What about the relationship between the designer and the CDM coordinator? And how do you see that working in practice?
Well, that's really at the heart of CDM, and it's really an enabling role. It's one of the key messages in CDM is cooperation, and it is about the coordinator and the designers cooperating together to make sure that the hazards and the risks in the construction process are removed at the design stage. And that really has to be team working and working together. It's not a case of somebody being 50 miles away asking to be sent lever arch files to check stuff. It is about working together, being at meetings to tease out these problems.
Peter,
Yeah.
is that it? Cooperation?
Cooperation, absolutely. I mean, traditionally, any project that's got lots of cooperation and lots of team working always runs well. And adding on top of that, the new ethos of CDM is a great way to go. Fundamentally, CDM coordinators need to have that people skill to tease out of people what they're doing and why they're doing it. So it's not just one particular part of the design team being conscientious, it's everybody, and carrying that through on towards the site works as well. Because again, these days, as I said earlier, construction projects are very complex. So we have all sorts of designers running down this chain towards site. So you'll have your principal designers, but you'll also have subcontract designers. CDM coordinators need to understand precisely how that may change the mix.
So
bring on other
communication,
risks.
right? So communication, people skills,
All
proper
that.
coordination all down
Yes.
the chain.
That's
All
right.
right. Well, interesting thoughts on that. Let's turn now to the files, plans and other matters. Perceived excessive and irrelevant paperwork was a major complaint against the previous regulations. So, what are the requirements now?
Well, things that must be undertaken for all construction work include the provision of pre-construction information and allowing adequate time for activities to be undertaken. And for notifiable projects, of course, the HSE must be notified, a construction phase plan developed and the CDM file kept up to date.
Peter, OK, let's look at the pre-construction information. Tell us about that.
Well, again, the emphasis is on focused information. It's on the fact that we should be addressing what information can make a real difference. So the pre-construction information should, as I mentioned earlier, focus entirely on what we are isolating as key hazards. They should be explained in a very simple way and drawn information, that after all that's the medium that most designers use, is by far the best way of doing it, with some annotated notes. So the information that the design team are passing on down the chain is fundamentally very crisp. As you say, gone are the days of huge formatted risk assessments and huge documentation. That didn't help anybody. In fact, actually, it distracted, I think Andrew would agree, that it distracted from fundamentally identifying the real hazards that will cause people some problems.
So, yes, Andrew, this pre-construction information, how do you see it? What would you want included?
Well, I totally agree with Peter. All information in the CDM has to be succinct, and when you're producing it, you must be quite clear who you're producing it for and what they need to know. And as Peter was saying, the days of sort of, oh, well, we'll send them everything just in case. Well, it's really quite damaging because we all know life is too short to read it all, and all the important stuff gets lost within in the padding. So information to enable people to be able to do their jobs needs to be short, sharp and succinct. OK, and then the construction phase plan. I mean, what should we look at for here, Peter?
Well, what we're looking for there is for the contractor to take on board, the construction team actually, not just the contractor, the construction team to take on board exactly what the designers have laid out for them. And the designers should also be aware of changes. Now these days the remit for designers varies all over the place. You can run from traditional contracts through to design and build contracts. So sometimes designers can be excluded from construction completely. In other cases they're involved intimately on what's going on site. In either respect though, designers should be keeping aware either through direct channels or through the CDM coordinator, precisely what is going on with the design, and is there anything that they're not picking up that the designers should be aware of and say, oh, wait a minute, that was in our risk assessment or that wasn't, and identifying some assistance to people further down the line. Again, the right information to the right people at the right time is the maxim in the approved code of practice, and that is a very good thought, and designers should keep aware of that. Just because it's on site doesn't mean to say it's gone away. And so I think that's a key issue that new CDM has brought in. It's brought a greater focus on exactly where we should take these things.
All right, so plenty to digest there. Let's have a look at a couple of examples to illustrate what we've been talking about today.
Our first example is of a structural engineering consultancy that's been engaged to provide detailed steelwork design drawings. The steelwork was to be incorporated into a complex alteration to an existing structure. The steel elements were all of different lengths. Furthermore, the site layout meant that it would be difficult to lift the beams into position during assembly.
Peter, as a designer, how would you proceed in an ideal world?
Well, in an ideal world, we would re-examine exactly what we've ended up with in that particular design. There's a number of aspects that have been teased out there that should start to just make the designer feel a little uneasy and say, well, hang on a minute, have we really done the best job here that we possibly can? What is the sequence of operations? Probably if the design is quite advanced, then you bring in somebody with construction experience, and then you start to analyse what's the ethos of the design, what are the practical issues of construction and assembly, and you start to think, okay, well maybe we can bring in smaller components, maybe we can look at a different way of orientating the construction on the site, and above all we make the elements easier to place. So we build in lifting hooks, we adapt to smaller, more manageable components, but again you've got to be aware of all the other aspects within the design. It shouldn't take over, it should be part of the overall package and be considered in proportion, and I think again that's the maturing of the CDM situation. It's part of a holistic view.
And I suppose what really we come back to there is what we were talking about earlier, the need for cooperation within the team.
Yeah.
Andrew, how do you encourage cooperation?
Well, you're exactly right. The key and the heart, I think we said earlier, of CDM is cooperation of all the people working together to reduce the amount of risk in the construction process. There's a clear duty under regulations to do that, but there's several effective ways that can be achieved. One is, I think it's a clear message in CDM, is where possible to have integrated teams, to get people working together as a team as early as possible, early appointments, so that everybody can contribute. And then there are a number of cases where designers may well engage contractors, speak to them about their expertise on site matters. This is a key way. Also having meetings to discuss design issues, and this is again a role for the coordinator to facilitate this, to get people working together. And
Peter, a thought?
There's a key element to that, which is to do with liability. Because I think, speaking from a practitioner's point of view, that a lot of people get very worried about being prosecuted. And I think there's several elements that have come out in the new CDM regs. One is that the HSE is not out to prosecute everybody. It wants everybody to do the right thing, to do the right process, so we get the right results at the end of the day.
But will prosecute. I mean, it's not surprising people are sort of worried about that.
You can't take away at all that this is criminal law. And therefore, the thought that this is one of the few times designers bump up against criminal law, it is crucial. It has got a hard edge. But fundamentally, what we're talking about is some very straightforward stuff. We're talking about people just doing their job, being professional, and looking out for what exactly are they designing. Why are they designing stuff in the way they're designing it? And will it make somebody have an accident later on?
And
that's the point.
Right, and taking that all through the chain in the decision making.
And don't be guarded about your views. Share them with others.
It's about good design, good engineering, people acting professionally.
Yeah.
Right. Well, let's take a look now at our second example.
And it's of a sports centre to be built on a contaminated site. A raft foundation was not viable from an engineering viewpoint, as the structure was to be built on an old landfill site. A piled foundation was therefore the only solution. But the next development was in a city with houses nearby, meaning that for noise reasons, driven piles were not allowed.
Well, Peter, goodness me, it would seem that augured piles would really be the only practical solution here.
Sure.
So what would you expect to happen next?
Well, there should be a complete analysis of what is happening underneath the site, exactly what is underneath that landfill, what's going on there, and we should be examining precisely what's going to be the implication of using the augured piles. If we've identified that this is going to cause considerable contamination, then we should maybe look at other innovative engineering solutions. Maybe we look at ground stabilisation, for instance, so you inject the top layers of the ground. That's, of course, me speaking as an architect, not as an engineer, so apologies for anybody who feels that's a naive engineering solution.
But that's the principle.
But you really need to go back to basic principles and examine whether, in fact, you're going down the right road or not. And if you've got no alternative but augured piles, then OK, let's close in on what are the real hazards. Let's get the operatives properly kitted out. Let's make sure no contamination is exposed to the greater environment. Greater effort on the process when you've really got to face something that's tricky. I think that's the answer. Maybe even consult the HSE, actually.
I'm sure. Never a bad thing. But I mean, we're talking about, this is a good example of providing information and how that's got to be provided. Now, under CDM 2007, how do you see this sort of information provided?
Well, there are a number of ways. The key point, I think, to start with is that the appropriate information is given to the appropriate people at the right time. It's not a case of giving everything to everybody. We discussed earlier that too much stuff is not very useful. Some key ways of doing it: notes and drawings are a very good way, because that's the vehicle we communicate in the construction industry with drawings. So important information on drawings. There may be a case for some written text, but the important thing is the appropriate information. And if you don't know, speak to people that will need to know. Actually communicate. We come back to this communication. If you get the opportunity, speak to the contractor. What does he need to know? What will help him?
Well, all right. Yes,
I was just going to say that one of the key factors there is that there is an underlying thread of giving people enough resources, enough time to do the job. If you're up against a time frame which is impossible, then you're going to make short circuit to processes. You're not going to consider things in detail. There's no time to engage an expert. So, for instance, if you end up with a very difficult problem to try and resolve, I don't understand how to do this, there's always an expert somewhere who can help you if you've got the time.
Time is the pressure for everybody.
Right.
We're out of time, but obviously consultation is clearly
Absolutely.
the key. Can I thank you both, Andrew East from the Health and Safety Executive and Peter Capelhorn from Scott Brownrigg. Thank you very much indeed. And that's all we have time for this month. Don't forget to take a look at the notes to accompany the programme, which are always worth a look. But for now, from all of us in the studio, till next time, bye-bye.